These are for you, sweetheart.
Oh, they're lovely.
I love you. What have you been doing all day?
I tidied up, I've not stopped. I've just sat.
Look at the lamp. Dust all over that. Get it sorted. What are you doing?
It's my sister.
You really going to answer that when we're having lunch?
I've not seen her in ages.
Go on then, let's spoil it. Go on. Answer it. Go on. Go on. You daft cow. Why have you bought all this expensive junk? I'll have to give you less money next time. Can't do anything right, can you? Yeah, Tom. Your mother's dressed like a clown. You shouldn't see it. It's classic, Liz. The only thing that's missing is a red nose. I'll start calling her Krusty from now on. Hello. I've messaged your dad. Told him we can't make his birthday. Can't be bothered with all your gang ignoring me.
Right.
It's just us. Get these cobwebs cleaned up. Wake up, you lazy pig. It looks ridiculous. Shut up. Think about it before you say anything. Why do you make me do these things? You're not going anywhere. You're staying here. You're staying here.
It's a powerful short film highlighting domestic abuse. My name is Dawn Walker, and I am Vice. Thank you for coming out today for this very important conversation. Eggshell was created through a collaboration of professional artists, healthcare partners, and courageous women who share these lived experiences. It sheds a light on how domestic violence goes far beyond physical harm, often involving emotional, psychological, sexual, and even financial abuse. This particular example highlights domestic violence amongst seniors. It's a widespread issue affecting 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men in the U.S. However, it disproportionately impacts women, ethnic minorities, and marginalized groups. By addressing these harsh realities, Eggshells calls for greater awareness, support, and resources for survivors, especially those who may feel isolated due to age or other circumstances. On behalf of the Office of the President and the Office of Communications and Marketing, we welcome you to today's conversation. I also bring greetings on behalf of President Riley, who extends his welcome and appreciation for the importance of this important conversation and for the support and work that all the advocates take care of. He extends his gratitude and appreciation to our panelists. Thank you for leading this important work, and greetings to those who join us in person and virtually. As part of Domestic Violence Awareness Month activities, today we'll hear from male advocates and allies who are leading this charge in changing the narrative around domestic violence. While much of this work has traditionally been led by women, and still is, as you can see by today's panelists, there is an increasing number of men invisible and leadership roles as advocates, helping to challenge these harmful stereotypes, promoting healthy relationships, and fostering a culture of accountability and respect. I'm honored to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Alan Lewis, who's Dean of our School of Health Professions. With more than 40 years of experience, Dr. Lewis has made a lasting impression as a clinician, educator, and researcher. Dean Lewis has secured over $18 million in federally funded research focusing on disability disparities and the influence of culture on disability experiences. He's also the author of We Are All Racists, the truth about cultural bias, a thought-provoking and data-driven exploration of how racial and cultural biases shape society. His commitment to health equity and diversity has earned him the prestigious 2024 Bobby Atkins Research Award for his groundbreaking work in multicultural rehabilitation. Dr. Lewis is dedicated to fostering professional development within the downstate community and encourages it across all disciplines. His ongoing lecture series, I should say, has become a vital platform for discussing key healthcare topics like telehealth, cultural competency, and data-driven decision-making, encouraging collaboration across disciplines, and equipping students and professionals with the tools to advance healthcare. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lewis, a leader who continues to inspire, and we appreciate you being here today. Thank you, Dr. Lewis.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome, and thank you very much, Dawn, for that introduction. That was too much, really. Give my humility. But anyway, thank you all for joining us both virtually and here. We're here today to talk about a very important topic, domestic violence. And as Dawn has said, we have an expert panel of men who are leading the charge to promote change in this phenomenon. So we're really going to have a great discussion. But before we do that, let me say a few preliminary things. Dawn's already sort of broken the ice in terms of telling you about domestic violence. You know, being the academic that I am, I have to define it first. Domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behavior in any relationship that is used by one partner to gain or maintain power and control over another intimate partner. It can be physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, or even technological. Actions and threats and patterns of coercive behavior that ultimately influence another person who's in the intimate partner relationship. This includes any behaviors that intimidate, manipulate, humiliate, isolate, frighten, terrorize, coerce, threaten, blame, hurt, injure, or wound someone. So just a few quick facts to sort of set the context. So nearly 20 people are physically abused by an intimate partner every minute in the United States. That adds up to more than 10 million women and men experiencing domestic violence each year. 1 in 4 women experience it, or 25%. 1 in 7 men experience it, or 14%. So we typically think about domestic violence as really only having victims that are female, but we also know men can be victims as well. Not as much, but can be. Intimate partner violence accounts for 15% of all violent crimes in the U.S. On a typical day, domestic violence hotlines receive more than 20,000 phone calls nationwide. More than half of all cases of domestic violence are never reported to police. So we know any numbers we talk about are really underestimates. In domestic violence homicides, women are 6 times more likely to be killed when a gun is in the house. Every year, 1 in 15 children, that's 6%, are exposed to intimate partner violence. And 90% of those children, 9 out of 10 of them, actually witness it firsthand. To Dawn's point about it having a disproportionately negative impact on communities of color, 47% of American Indian and Alaskan Native women are victims. 45% of non-Hispanic Black women are victims. 37% of white women, 34% of Hispanic women, and 18% of Asian and Pacific Island women. The lifetime economic cost of intimate partner violence, same thing as domestic violence, is $3.6 trillion in our country. On average, more than 3 women and 1 man are murdered by their partners every day in the U.S. So domestic violence really has several levels of impact. Obviously, the victims, the children who are bystanders and observe this and learn this as a normal behavior, which we know it's not, and even the perpetrators are also impacted by this because that's how it becomes the intergenerational curse. And society, as you just heard, the $3.6 trillion in our population, medical costs, criminal justice costs, lost productivity from work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we know it's an intergenerational phenomenon that self-sustains itself. And we're here today to talk about how men can lead the charge to break that cycle. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panel and ask them to come up as I introduce them. And these men are true experts. They have a lot of background and knowledge in this area. And so I'm going to give you a snapshot of who they are. And as they do their initial comments, they can add some more information as needed. So Quentin Walcart. Quentin is our executive director of something called Connect New York City, also known as Q, he likes to be affectionately called. He has over 22 years of having engaged men and boys as allies and activists in the movement to prevent intimate and gender-based violence. He was named a New York New Abolitionist in 2014. Quentin was one of 100 U.S. leaders selected by the Novo Foundation to participate in its groundbreaking move to end the violence initiative. Quentin also is a co-founder and chief organizer of Father's Day Pledge Against Violence, which this June in New York City, it was kicked off as a 14-year annual event. Quentin was awarded the United Nations Trust to End Violence Against Women Award in 2014. He was the first man to receive the now New York City Susan B. Anthony Award in 2012. Okay, next panelist, Marlon Walker. Marlon also works at Connect New York City. He's a co-director of programs. He's a full-time trainer and educator. Everybody calls me M, affectionately known as M, thank you. Q and M. With over 2 decades of experience working with families and youth affected by violence and facilitates the Latino speaking support group. He also holds workshops for high schools and fatherhood and job placement and reentry programs for persons who have had criminal justice involvement. Previously worked as an early Head Start teacher, a family worker, and a male involvement coordinator. Having grown up in Latin America, he is passionate about helping men understand their roles as fathers, partners, and role models. We also have Sam Young, who actually works here downstate in the social work department. Go downstate. Sam has over a decade of experience and is dedicated to serving diverse populations through impactful social work. He's worked in clinical settings, social work service agencies, educational institutions, all leveraging his crisis intervention and advocacy expertise, and his care planning skills to improve outcomes of persons and their families. He works here downstate, as I mentioned. He works closely with interdisciplinary teams, addresses patient grievances, and builds community partnerships to ensure seamless discharge and follow-up care. In previous roles, Sam has served as a local school transition coordinator for New York State Office of People with Developmental Disabilities, supporting students with special needs and transitioning to adult services. He has extensive aftercare experience, and he's driven by passion and advocacy and care for empowering individuals and families during their most challenging times with compassion and leadership. And our final expert on the panel is Nathaniel Talbot. He said, call him Nate. Clinical Director of the Transformative Justice Collective Urban Research Institute. Nate is a licensed clinical social worker with extensive experience in school and community-based settings. Over the past decade, he's worked as a social worker, professional development facilitator, and restorative justice facilitator. He has a passion for community-based interventions and places emphasis on intimate partner violence and community healing. And he's got a whole bunch of academic degrees. So with that, I'll ask the panelists to come on up. Come on up and join me at the front table so we can get started with our conversation. So what we have asked them to do, of course, I have already given them some prompts and questions that can stimulate the conversation as needed. But I'd like to start off by asking each one to, in turn, give a 5-minute overview of what they're doing and what they think the solution is to this problem in terms of men leading the charge to reduce domestic violence. And then after that initial commentary from each of our panelists, we'll have sort of a naturally evolving organic conversation for the next 20 or so minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. So let's start on the end down there. Quentin, will you start first, sir? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Quentin Walcott. All my friends and family call me Q, so feel free to do the same. The statistics, I think, are important to frame the conversation, but I think the statistics don't cover the actuality of the situation because, one, it's those are the people that report, and there's so many people that don't report or even recognize the fact that they are struggling with this issue as either someone who's being harmed, someone who witnesses, and sometimes we're all three, someone who also commits harm. So I think, and that's more of a realistic take on what this issue is. And, the definition, was broken down as a consistent pattern or act, but I just want you to think about domestic violence. At the core of it is power and control. Someone wants it or someone wants to maintain it. So the strategy is power and control, and using all of those different forms and types that he mentioned are the tactics, or the tools that you use to gain power and control. And one thing I don't want you to leave with today, as I'm sure many of you know, is that physical violence is not the only, sometimes we think of domestic violence, we think of a black eye, we think of a bloody nose, we think of black and blue marks, but that's probably it's not even the most used form of violence. It's the most visible. It's a form of violence that can get you past the clerk at family court. But it's the psychological, it's the emotional, all of these things. Not one thing is happening, it's usually multiple things happening in that. So I think it's, I think it's an attractive thing to say, men leading this charge, right? And I thought a lot of people that piqued a lot of people's interest. It's not a new thing. I've been doing, I started this work when I was 2 years old. So like 24 years later, I'm still doing the work, right? So it's something that, men are doing. The intentionality of the work, I think, is really different around, I'm a man that's doing work around power and control, violence against women and girls primarily, but really engaging men in transforming attitudes and belief systems, right? That is our work. And to see how they, and how we do that is an examination of how we show up in the world and why do we show up that way. And because of race, class, gender, orientation, and age, we show up very differently at different points in time. But with that, being a male, something that we do have, the moment that we are born, we have male privilege, right? When they see us, we have male body parts. Our trajectory and path in the world is very different from our, folks who identified as female when they're born, very differently, down a different path. When you put that blue blanket on us, it's very different from putting that pink or white blanket on someone who's identified as a female at birth. At that moment in time, our paths change. The fact that I'm a male, but I'm not a white male, right? So we talk about the intersections of kind of power and how that works. It's, race, class, gender, all those things I talked about, those power groups. And some people benefit from that construction of power, and some of us don't. So a white male in today's society has the highest form of privilege. And even though I'm a male, I don't have white privilege, I still have male privilege. And I want to emphasize that because even in my home communities and the communities that we primarily work in, Black and Latino, immigrant, Caribbean communities that we work in, there's still something called male privilege, right? How I have access to the world is very different from my sister or my girlfriend or my wife or my cousin or my mother, right? So I just want to kind of lay that as a foundation. So a lot of this work, when we talk about men's work or men leading this charge, it's about manhood, it's about maleness, it's about masculinities, not one form of masculinity. Like right now, the most popular term is toxic. Everybody says toxic masculinity. And some people would argue any form of masculinity is problematic, right? I have a different belief on that, right? I was trained by, my mentor, Dr. John Aponte, and he framed masculinity very differently, right? Particularly from a Latino cultural ethnic perspective. It means many different things. But the most important part of that, so you have male privilege, you have certain levels of masculinity, and just our levels of power. If you add those things together, it can be very problematic. Problematic for particularly women, problematic for men who don't live up to a certain standard of machismo or masculinity. So that is the work, right? It's not necessarily saying stop being abusive. See people, at the basic level, see people as human beings. It's 2024, and we have to say, women are human beings. Other people are human beings. People of color are human beings. Folks who weren't born in the United States are human beings. All these different situations are really what the work is, right? So we're doing work around intimate partner violence or domestic violence or ultimately gender violence. But the reality is that we're doing human relationship work, and we are telling people, and really men in particular I'm calling out, is because if you scratch the surface of any form of violence against women and girls, war, wherever violence shows up in your life, community violence, there'll be a man standing there. And that's one of the most difficult things we have to do as men, is to grapple with that reality and that fact, is that we are committing most of the violence. So the stats that Dr. Lewis talked about, where men are, I think it's, day-to-day changes, 1 to 7, 1 to 8, 1 to 6, men are being harmed. In domestic violence and sexual violence, that's typically by men as well. Not just what the harm are doing against women. Men are at the root of a lot of violence. And I do a lot of work internationally as well, African countries, Asia. And so the work, when I come in to do it, the interesting part about it is that because it's violence against women, it's a secondary issue. It's not a primary issue. It's not considered crime like here in the United States. One of the struggles with the feminist movement and the women's movement is that violence against women needs to be portrayed as a real crime. So the struggles and the movements over the years have been about that women are seen as human beings who were harmed. Just like you steal a car, there's a set amount of time you're going to get once you're caught. Over the years, when violence against women was an issue, particularly when men were committing that violence, depending on your race and class, you likely did not get any time or be, sent to a batter's program or things like that. That was very debatable. So a lot of the fights over the years was really about women's rights, women's autonomy, women's agency, and women seen as human beings. So the fact that we have four or five men on this panel talking about this issue is significant because the privileges that we have, women, and I struggle with the term men leading. We have to be co-leaders in this. We have to be allies. We have to be co-conspirators in this work that we're doing today. And men, and I believe, men can do this work. Those of us who are enlightened, because the work really is about changing attitudes and belief systems at the core of it. So that's what we're doing when we're working with men. We want them to see not only as people as human beings, but as equal, as mutual partners in life, right? In life. So the fact that men are up here doing this work is significant. But I would say this, and as we go along in the conversation today, it's not just about men doing this work. And I've been doing this work for almost 25 years now. And especially in the very beginnings of this work, what I would get was that, oh, Q, the fact that, your presence in a room is just amazing. And now was like the threshold of my work. I wasn't held accountable. Nobody even knew what I said. I would do trainings in the very beginning. There'd be a room just like this, all full of women. right? So my critique was that, Q, why are you doing this work to be around women? Men would critique me, and this is from women and my colleagues. Men would say, yo, what are you doing exposing the men's code? You know, certain things that we never kind of hold each other accountable for. So we have to kind of keep that in mind. So there's multiple ways of the risks of us being on this table and this panel right now that we struggle with. But I think for all of us, and I can speak for all of us, is that the greater good is for our own humanity. And one of the tricks that I'll give you all now is in my work with men is to have them see not only the detriment to women and girls and kids around male behavior, male violence, and underscore male violence, because that's what we're really talking about when we talk about domestic violence. One of the tricks that I said was that to show these men that your behavior impacts you more than it impacts the women. Because male violence is about that power and control, but one of the phenomenons of male violence is violence against women and girls. That's sexual and domestic and what have you. So we have to just be honest about that and take a look at that and where does that come from, these attitudes, and not only where it comes from, what supports it. So we'll talk a little bit about that today. So I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Marlon, thank you, sir. You're up.
We ain't got much to say now. So for me, first thing first, I know we over here talking about men leading this, but the reality is women have been at the forefront of this and still continue to do that work. And we need to be very clear about that. Even I'm up here with these men in Q who I admire and I love, but really, well, it was women who really taught me what men's work looked like. So let's put that. The film Eggshells, I like that also because we are so caught up in this whole idea of physical abuse. And usually when you get services, people go for services when physical abuse has happened. Black eyes, broken bones, right? Nobody is calling the cops and saying, he's calling me a bitch. Can you come? Nobody's calling for that, right? So understanding that sometimes those words are even worse than getting hit. I remember I had a client who told me, I wish he was hitting me because what he's doing now is worse, right? From the verbal, the emotional, the psychological, right? I want to talk also in terms of the healing part of the men that I work with. And I'm talking about, we work from junior high schools, grown men, senior citizens, both in English and Spanish. And 8 out of 10 of these men and young men have been physically abused or sexually abused as children, right? Not to give it an excuse, but it's about understanding where all that pain is coming from, how they are using that pain to gain some type of power and control over their partner, over their families, right? So for us, it's about how can we hold them accountable for their actions, and at the same time, how can we make sure that they heal and become, as Q said, a human being? And sometimes it's hard because we have to deal with that. For me, I will tell you straight up, my triggers is when somebody tells me that they sexually abuse a child. I already know back in my head, this is not a person that I could be working with. And this is why we have supports and allies that we could send somebody to do that work, right? So you have to know what works for you, what doesn't work for you, what you are comfortable with, what you're comfortable with, right? And domestic violence, you're supposed to be uncomfortable. This is not a go-lucky topic. If you're not feeling uncomfortable, then we are not doing our job, right? And more than anything, the groups that I work with, the group that I run, whether in English or Spanish, I always tell them this is more about me than it is about you. You have to see and believe that what I'm telling you is true because I have to live that. And if I don't live that and I don't portray that, then why will you believe anything that I'm saying to you? Right? And I leave it at that so the conversation can flow.
Thank you very much. Sam, sir.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank everyone, especially Dawn and the panel for inviting me to be here to speak about this very important topic. Um, in my role as a social worker, I became a social worker, uh, or I did personally, because of the things that I had seen in my own life. And as we spoke about earlier, in our communities, in our homes, domestic violence take on a different role, different looks in different houses. I didn't have to worry about that in my house. My mother was too strong to allow that. But there were ways that it was evident in my home and it had an effect on me. As a child, and even as a grown man now, I can still, as I shared with some of my colleagues, I can still remember those times and I can relate back to how it affected me and changed me to make me the man that I am today, and the reason why I wanted to even become a social worker. So it is important for me to be here today just so that men can lead the charge and be a part of the discussion and be a good advocate for women and for those who are being abused in domestic violence situations. And that's the reason why I'm here today. And just to be here to really learn from the panel. I'm here to take in as much information as I am to give what I know. In my role here at the hospital, it is to look for those signs of domestic violence and to try to put resources or give the person resources to help them out of their situation or figure out a safe plan for them. All right, so I just want to thank you again and the panel. I'm looking forward to hearing you all and learning from you all. And thank you.
All right, Nate, sir,
Jump in.
jump right in.
I'm so excited to be a part of this panel. The work that people have done and the stuff that I'm hearing has been so foundational to the work that we've done. I really appreciate Q and Marlon being here and Sam being here. I'm thinking about other people. I'm thinking about John Aponte, thinking about Samuel Amer. I'm thinking about my brother Gene Johnson, who's not here. A bunch of people who have done important work and has really helped us grow in this. You know, I would be remiss too if I didn't mention like the Black feminist work that has really informed a lot of our practice. I'm thinking about Bell Hooks. I'm thinking about Audre Lorde. I'm thinking about even more modern people like Adrienne Maree Brown. All of this work has been so foundational to the stuff that we do. And to Q's point, when I think about leadership, um, I do think about it like differently, not necessarily, we think about traditional heteronormative, we're going to lead the charge and tell y'all what we need to do. But I really think about us as men. And I will say there's probably a quality of all of us that is very traditional. We probably all comfortable being in front of the room and holding court and stuff. And I think there's some reality and there's a reason why we're doing this. And I think we are also working really hard to take our responsibility for ourselves and our own emotions and model that for people. I think even as a therapist with a bunch of degrees and all of that stuff and does a lot of training, I still have to work hard not to fall into traditional male tropes, right? I had a group the other time last year. I did a group, we do rotating cohorts. And we model vulnerability for people. And I talked about overworking, like, right, just working a lot. I got like 3 jobs. I got that. Regular stereotypes. Got a lot of jobs. And then I did the same thing again with a group. They like, oh, you still struggling with that, right? And I think about what Marlon said. Like, we really are modeling a lot of the work that has to be done for folks, right? Because a lot of that eggshell stuff that we saw, that's a lot of people projecting their emotional needs and what they need to be taken care of and enforcing that responsibility on our female identified folks in this country, in this world. When you think about patriarchy, so many men are so disconnected from themselves that just being able to speak about things they experience or things they feel, it's both cathartic and scary, right? So like there's some release there and there's also some fear there. So I think about what does it mean for us even to just be together in this space? Because I know, being one of few in a room full of women, you kind of get used to that too, right? Like you kind of like the whole court, or you be there, you'll be in front of the room a lot. So I just think a lot about our work as really like tapping into that, being able to model that. I remember running groups where guys were like, yo, you listen to what the person said and then you reframed it back to them. That's incredible. I'm like, yeah, okay. Like, but people really following and thinking about the stuff that we do. And I think when we do this work, I think we're modeling something where we challenge ourselves to be vulnerable in rooms and to talk about the things that we might be experiencing. Even now, I was at an outreach event and there was a rape whistle on the table, and I'm like, oh, what's that for, right? That's a privilege I have. I don't think about what that means, right? And that's just somebody who's an expert in the field to a degree, right? So we have to think about how that comes up, how we challenge ourselves to really be vulnerable and thoughtful about those kind of things and how it impacts people. So, for me, my work has been it's been all of the academic stuff. It's been learning about groups. It's been being able to reference and quote therapists, which I could do for you 100 times. But it's also being able to be present, being able to think about the things that come up for me every day, being able to both make it about myself, but also make room for others, and be able to be willing to take that first step towards us being able to be in a room and acknowledge that our experiences are not the center of the world, right? And we also have to take ownership for our own experiences, right? Like our own emotions, our own feelings, and be able to be humbled and know when I am feeling my privilege, to Q's point earlier, when I am doing stuff or I am tone deaf. So throughout this, I like to reference people in the audience. So I'll reference my partner over there, Teal, my coworker who really helps me think about stuff when we do this stuff together. And I think again, to emphasize Q's point, our leadership is collective. It's not necessarily us going to the charge and being the good guys this time, but thinking about how we can expand leadership and think about what that means and really flesh out what masculinity means outside of dominance or power or external validators like being able to give a bunch of speeches or have a bunch of degrees or have a bunch of partners or a bunch of money, but really be able to tune into what does it mean to feel our own experiences. And then we could also talk about the experience of men of color, right? Because that's different, right? We talk about we all probably have experiences, if we think about that to Marlon's point, that have been violent at the hands of systems. I oftentimes tell my team I have glaucoma in this eye from getting beat up by cops, right? So all them degrees didn't really protect me from that, right? All that privilege didn't protect me from that. And when we think about the people that we work, one of the reasons why it's important for us in particular, for this particular melanated group of men to be in there, probably have some of these experiences there, is because we get the opportunity to both validate people's experience and maybe pull apart the things that get conflated and combined when we feel tension within our communities. Because, to quote Till, our relationships are often mirrors of what we experience. And when we see such violence happen, I think it's easy to take it out at home. It's easy to take it out on your kids. It's easy to take it out on the people that's closest to you, or expect them to take care of you when you're feeling something. And we work really hard to help people identify what they need and figure out how to take care of themselves. So,
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to throw a few questions at the panel, but before I do that, let me just say again, thank you for coming today. And I think you can already see what an important discussion this is and the expertise that we have here for this topic. So thank you for being here. And we will have a time for Q&A, but we're not quite there yet, but we'll get there. So for now, it's just the panelists discussing. And so let me throw a question out to the panelists. These guys are amazing, but let me just say, what strategies can we deploy, given that we're trying to engage more men in being part of the positive change? And I realize that women have to also still be in their roles to support and be a part of the process as well. But we really do need more men. So what strategies do you all think we should be engaging to make sure we solicit more men to come to the table and be a part of the solution for domestic violence? Things you haven't already said. Or you can underscore those points if you want.
I'll jump into that. First of all, it's not a one-size-fits-all. We got to recognize that domestic violence looks very differently. There's different types of victim survivors. There's different types of people who do harm. And there's also different approaches to reaching these people. I used to joke about this a lot, but some semblance of truth to it. Because, Marlon and I, through the Connect Training Institute, we train, we just turned 20 years old last March. So give us a round of applause on that. But in those 20 years, one of the things I started when I came to Connect was the Connect Training Institute. And through the Connect Training Institute, we train folks to work with survivors, to do women's support groups and women's empowerment groups. We trained co-ed teams to work with abusive partners. And so through that, we come across a lot of men that we trained, and Marlon was one of those men years ago. And I would say out of the 10, out of 10, each out of 10 men, maybe one would get it, right? Would understand the full components and dynamics of what it takes for a male to be doing this, let alone a man of color doing this, right? Because like Nate mentioned, you know, there's a certain, everybody's using this term, secret sauce that we have when we're engaging our own folks in our own communities. There's a certain language that we can speak to that many other people cannot. Even our sisters who have been doing this work for years and engaging men, there's something different that we have. Because like for many years, I was a co-executive director with a woman, right, Sally McNichol. So not only was she a woman, she was a white woman, and she was about 20 years older than I was, right? So we had these different intersections. So some of the things that, you know, Sally would say, or Sally even taught me, you know, over the years, Sally would say would fall on deaf ears. Because one, she was a white woman in a black and brown community, immigrant community. And secondly, in terms of engaging men, she was a woman engaging men. So I would come in and say the same thing she said. You'd be like, oh, wow, cute, that makes sense. I understand what you're saying. But it's exactly what Sally mentioned. So I think it's, one part of it is that recognizing who you are and how you show up and what community you're in and what are the needs of that community. Because our approach is not to come in and say, and Marlon remembers this, you know, I run a men's roundtable, which is going to be tonight. It's been going on for years, along with the Marlins roundtable, Hombres de Legando. And it's like, I used to call it the men's domestic violence roundtable. It was me and Marlon in the group, right? So you got to be creative. You have to, but not fool anybody about what you're talking about. You got to be creative around what you call it, right? And then, you know, so that's an important piece. That's one level of it. The other thing I used to joke about is the men that we were able to train, and some of them were probably even better than us, you know, as terms of facilitators and trainers. But we cannot keep them because there was no money in it for them, even though they were great, dynamic individuals. And that was just an honest point we had to look at, right? And I mention that because for a lot of people, it's like, when Connect first hired me, we were part of the Urban Justice Center at the time, but when they first hired me, I was the first male that they hired. So the flack was that you're spending money on women, on a male employee. What is that? So that gave me a little, that gave me some trauma. Like every time I walked in a room, they were like, oh, he's taking a woman's position. So for me, one of the things that became paramount for me was to raise monies for the men's work that did not interrupt or take away from work with survivors. So that was my goal. I'm still trying to figure that out because it's still not a lot of money in this in terms of programmatically for, you know, devoting time and energy towards the men's side of this. And I think that's important because men are the ones who are committing most of the harm. So if you truly want to prevent or effectively intervene, you must address men. You must engage men. That will move the needle. So I just said that to say that we got to be creative in that. There's no 5 steps you take, but there are a couple of steps I will say is that, one, we have to be consistent, right? One of the things that you'll get or hear about us is that, damn, they're still doing it. My thing was, even when Marlon was coming up, was like, you know, in the work, not in life, but in work, is like, do the group, same time every day. Eventually they will come. In the beginning, it's like, oh, wow, nobody showed up. There's only one person. But if you consistently are there with these principles and being creative and really communicating what's going on, and, you know, as people in social work field, you know, taught to not tell your own story. In this work, you better tell your story, right? And it's not only just about what's important about being a credible messenger in terms of this work, you know, experiencing what other people have experienced. But I think it's really important to tell your story because not everybody's story the same either. So I believe in a model of, like on this panel right now, 4 or 5 levels of types of masculinity. I believe in many of masculinity rather than one type, and you lay that on top of everyone. So I think just being creative and understanding, who you're working with and why you're working with them. If it's young people, if it's adult men, if it's women, and whatnot. And I'll just say this other thing, that one thing, Jamal and I both came out of Head Start models, father involvement, which were really about involving fathers in the lives of their children. So one of the things I've always borrowed from Head Start model was, if you're working with a child who's struggling because they might be witnessing domestic violence, is engage both parents, right? Not together, because if it's domestic violence, that creates a whole nother dynamic of getting genuine, authentic storytelling from those who's being harmed, and even the person doing the harm, but to engage both of them so they're involved in the life of their children. And that way it could be an entry point into getting that man the help that they need to interrupt that violence so that it doesn't pass on to the children.
Other comments?
Thank you for that,
Question?
Q. For me, it's about meeting people where they're at. I know it's a tagline now. Um, so for me, for example, my father was a machetero from Puerto Rico. My mother's family fought social justice in Panama, and I became a high school history teacher, right? So it's a lineage there. And I know that, I understand that. Uh, the one thing I never got, because when it was discussed, especially in Latin America, where we don't think about women's issues, we don't think about your blackness. You got to think about the country first. Everything else is on the side. Think about your country, right? So talking about gender issues, it never really resonated with me. Until one day, I was sent to a workshop led by Q, um, and it was like, oh wow, eye opening. One, it wasn't. It was more about the content, right? Domestic violence, but the way that connect us is by mixing all these intersections, whether it's race, politics, culture, faith, all these things that they tell you don't ask people about their stuff. Connect was doing that. On top of that, seeing a black man, a straight black man, sitting in front of me, talking the way he was talking about this, it was one of those things that connected me to him and said, this is the type of work that I want to do. When I joined Connect, then I was sent to a couple of conferences around the country, and there were men speaking about this, and intelligent, um, intelligent white men. They were great. What they were saying makes sense, but it wasn't a connection in terms of I can bring that to the population I'm working with, and I was happy that if those group were my first introduction to this, I don't think I'll be doing this work. So I'm glad that I met you first, right, to do that. Now, moving forward now that I do a lot of work in high schools, this year we had 25 boys in my group graduated. And I've been with them for over 3 years with the same group. So I saw the growth, I saw the maturity, right? Many of them went to colleges outside of New York, but the ones that stayed in New York begged me, whenever you're going to start the group back again, can we come in so that we can support and be a volunteer in working with the other young men? And to me, once again, they saw a reflection of me on them and vice versa.
And just to add one thing like this, having a safe space where people can get together and have conversations, men can get together, young boys, and have conversations about what is positive masculinity. How can we support or change things, right? We don't want things to be the same, especially when you're coming from a situation where a child has experienced it or have known it in their childhood, in their lifetime, or they've seen it in their household. In my past, I have worked with children in foster care who were separated, some of them because of domestic violence. And this is a concern, right? The parents are concerned that the child is going to be a repeat offender. It's something that they've learned how to express themselves. And so being able to be there and having a support, a facility, a place for us to have a conversation, scripted or unscripted, about their feelings, their emotions, what they actually been through, and providing a space to give feedback. To me, that is one way that we can absolutely continue to make a difference and a positive change.
Thank you.
Sure. And to quadruple down on what everybody's saying about credible messages and spaces for people. In my experience of doing the work, I've been doing the work since maybe 2012 or 2013. I have never found um, a young man or young man of color in particular that wasn't really excited to have like a genuine connection with another person. Um, I think about it when I was working with young people. I started working in middle schools and stuff, and working my own stuff out. I started raising kids and making them my little brother and son, maybe too much. I think about when I was in high schools, it was a similar experience where people felt really seen and respected and heard. And one thing that was really surprising to me is when I started doing domestic violence work and I was working with people older than me that said I felt like a father figure, right? Or somebody who feels really seen and valid. And really, all I was doing was validating the experience, right? Like really, really listening. And I felt it, right? Like, because I know it enough. There's a Huey Newton quote that comes to mind. He talks about taking the skills of the bourgeoisie, rejecting the bourgeoisie, and bringing it back home to the community. I think that has been like a very foundational part of like my work. And I think about how we really use forms that allow us to like support and express ourselves, in particular for young men, and men just in general. You know, I in my work in this transformative justice collective stuff, I've been doing a lot of work within the agency, and my agency is mostly women. And we have like a men's group, and we started running circles. I'm not sure if people are familiar with circle practice, but it's an indigenous practice where people ask themselves questions. In the first circle we did, everybody was crying, right? These are like, you know, men's men, for lack of a better term, right? And I think about how if we want to recruit people in there to also to double down on what Q said, resource is huge, right? There is a part of, if we want to deconstruct stuff, right? We want people to invest in trying to be different. We have to do stuff different systemically. Like this work has to be valuable, right? Especially when you have people trying not to be dominant or measure themselves by external markers like money or partners or like what they bring to the table. I think that's really important. And we have to just continue to do the work at all levels, right? Oftentimes we'll have kids who have received such great treatment and they go back home and you get like triple the amount of stuff than what you got in 2 hours with us in a group or in a couple sessions with us. So how do we continue to spread this work and this resource to other spaces? To double down on what Marlon said, how do we meet people where they're at? How do we create spaces where people can ask themselves questions, can be heard, can share with each other, can give positive regard to each other? Because unfortunately, I've seen a lot of men both come via mandates, like they have a court case and then they're so happy to connect with other people and they make deep friends. And I know a lot of times the fear is negative cohesion. I could tell you probably all of us up here, we probably it ain't really happening, right? Like we're going to probably steer it away somehow and allow people to connect positively. And you see how hungry people are for that, right? Like really, really hungry to do that. So I'm thinking about how we make more space to have that be normative, right? Like it not be something that has to come via somebody went to jail or somebody got locked up or you only could be 18. How do we put resource into it so that these people that are brilliant don't end up leaving for private practice or have to become a lawyer or have to do something else, or have to become a principal, because this is seen as more of an aside, right? To Q's point earlier, like this is not secondary, this is important. And anytime we do work where we're asking a social construct to be changed, it needs a lot of resource, both emotionally, physically, and financially.
Okay. Go ahead.
And I think that's important. Just kind of reiterate some things I just said. Creating a safe space. You know, a lot of times people just assume that men have that, can talk about that, and just kind of this. The thing is that we do have places where we talk about, but what do we talk about, right? I think that is the key, not just collecting men and having these spaces, but like what are we really talking about? Is it safe enough to say that, yes, I'm struggling in my relationship? Yes, I'm struggling at work. I'm struggling with my health. And all these things are factors into how we treat our partners and how we treat our children and all of these things. So I think that is key. And then also thinking outside the box, right? There's debate in the field around restorative justice is probably the most organic and historic thing that we've had in place for so long now, and it's been effective, right? So the models that we use to engage men around, particularly around men who are violent in relationships, what works and what doesn't work, right? Is it the traditional model, clinical models, community models? Is it psychoeducational, whatever it may be? Those are the struggles, right? So some of those groups will last, 12 weeks, or if you're doing a battles program in a national sense, at the minimum it's 26 weeks or 55 weeks or 52 weeks. But either way, the trick is that even if you go through that process, and some of the men get it, some don't. Some know enough to tell you what to give you the verbiage or the jargon to kind of say, all right, he gets it because he knows the language. But have they internalized it is the trick. And then secondly, are we creating a culture outside of that? Like I think they mentioned, you have a group to go through it, they go home, and they undo everything that they've learned with you. So everything is you undo whatever that culture was in that community or in that relationship. They're good with you for, the clinical sense for, 18 weeks or whatever it may be. But then they go home and everything is unlearned once they get around their boys and other kind of male culture and examples of maleness. So the trick is for us in this work is to create that second tier where there's a group of men who are still in their process of changing, some who are more advanced than others, but to create a culture around that so everything doesn't get undone, right? And how to pass it on to other men and be examples for other boys.
Safe space is key. Um, we always talk about working with young people, but remember, we have to work with the adult men because they are mimicking adult behavior. Um, and to Nate's point, right? I remember with this young man went to school. We were talking about sexual abuse. That was a Friday. He came back Monday, telling me that, "Oh, Marlon, you ruined my weekend." I said, "What happened?" I said, "We're hanging out with my boys, and they were about to rape this girl, and I used every example that you told us for them to stop." And I said, "Uh-huh." They stopped. I said, "Oh, that's great. So what's the problem?" When I went home, I told my father and my uncle, and they were upset at me. They told me, "You dumbass. If you would have kept your mouth shut, you could have gotten some." So, talking about undoing everything that we speak about, we have to work with these adult men and creating that safe space, as you mentioned. Sometimes the safe space can create other things. I work with senior citizens, Connect. We've been doing this for years now. And now the senior citizens are getting so comfortable that sometimes I'm uncomfortable. Uh, and hey Marlon, guess what? I said, "What?" "Oh man, I had to use the bathroom in the subway. I didn't have a Pampers, so I just let it out right there." And I'm like, "Yeah, okay."
All right. So let me just say at this point, time is not our friend. We have a lot more we can talk about. We're at the end of our time. We're going to open up for questions, but let me ask a few more questions, and I'll ask the panelists to be concise on these next few questions. A couple questions, because they're experts. So you're an expert. You have a lot to say. Uh, absolutely, but you have a lot to say. So I'm gonna ask a couple questions. You guys address whichever one makes sense because you've said a lot of things. One of the things we wanted that sort of has come out implicitly and somewhat explicitly, the race piece. We know that we have black men leading the change, or men of color leading the change, and I heard somebody reference that there are white men doing it as well. So address one of you or several of you address the whole issue of race. How important is it that it is men of color doing this? That's one question. The other question is, just came up to me. Both you on the end, Q and Marlon, talked about things being undone. We've known in the clinical world for years that you can take a person and expose them to something in an artificial environment, a group, clinic, whatever. But that means nothing when they go back to the natural in vivo environment because the forces in that environment are strong. So speak to how we can get more men into some of those natural environments in vivo, more so. Other than doing a group over here in this building, how do we get some of you all as leaders in that home to intervene right there where it makes a difference in vivo in the natural environment? And then final question, I'm throwing a lot at you, I know, because we're out of time. I hate coming to trainings and panels and people don't address what can I do starting tomorrow to change this. So somebody please address what men, most importantly, but also all of us can do starting tomorrow to try to be a part of the solution. So first question, race, the whole race piece, which we've talked about a lot. Second question, how do we get these interventions that Black men or men of color are leading in the natural environment, in vivo, in the home, where it can really make a long-term difference? And then what can we all think about in terms of our role to make changes starting tomorrow? Tomorrow's Friday. I want to know what I can be doing differently, thinking, attitudes, behavior, whatever it may be, to positively impact this problem. So everybody don't have to speak on everything, but whatever jumps out of you of those three.
That sound like an hour right there.
No, that's what I said. Everybody don't have to speak on every one. So jump out. The race piece, in vivo interventions. How do we get this more in vivo rather than in an artificial in vitro group somewhere outside of the natural environment? And then what can we all think about starting tomorrow that we can do differently so that down the road we can see some changes?
For the race piece, actually Q and I can tag team on this. We were doing a training at a school, if you remember, and the kids were they were tuned out. And we were like, man, we thought we good at this. Like, what's going on here, right? And finally we said, you know what, let's put the curriculum on the side and let's address this. So,
Yeah, there was one thing too is about systems, right? Especially education systems and how they bring people like us in. A lot of times they bring us in, it's a one shot deal. So you got 45 minutes, 50 minutes, whatever it may be, with these young people, and then they're never seen again. I think somebody talked about it. Sometimes we open these kids up and we don't follow up, right? We get them to talk about their trauma, tell their stories, and we don't follow through, or the program ends or loses its funding, whatever it is. So these young kids, like, Black and Latino men coming in, and the consistency part I mentioned earlier was the trick, not just having them one period, but at least a semester, not the semester, the whole year. And in many cases, we're able to have them for multiple years. And you can really, truly see the impact that way, like that example Marlon mentioned. But the other thing was that, one, they were not used to Black and Latino men being in their lives. So many of them, they didn't have, their fathers went around for whatever reason, locked up, passed away, whatever, they weren't there. So a lot of the projection around the fathers not being out was taken out on us. And we were like, what is going on? Marlon's a brilliant trainer. Charismatic, the whole thing. They were not feeling us. They were not feeling us at all. So we had to build the trust. But then it was like, then we got it. On the way home, we're like, we're their fathers and uncles and big brothers that aren't there anymore. So we had to build that trust. So part of it was that, to the point where I don't like to talk about this, but these kids are huge, right? But they kind of got in our faces, and we were like, do we have to knock these kids out? Let's step in the hallway, and then no physical stuff, but had a conversation with this huge man, and he broke down and learned his story, and he cried. But then we got him open. So not just getting him open, but being consistent every week. We were there. He became like the third facilitator in the room. He's like, yo, shut up, y'all. He did it in a different way. We said no cursing unless it's in context. These kids used in context for every curse they made. But once you win them over and consistent in their lives and being straight up honest with them around, and prepare for separation anxiety. That last, don't wait till the last group or session to say, oh, we're not going to be here. We may not come back in the fall, but to deal with that. And I'll just touch on the race thing real quick. Everybody knows the P. Diddy situation going on, right? So one, there's a lot of harm done, trafficking, profitability. Violence against women is profitable. Racism is profitable. Classism is profitable. So we got to recognize that. And in what ways? Some of it is monetarily, some ways a false sense of esteem or power. But when the race thing comes up, because of, and I'm not going to just say black men's experience with systems and police and courts and things like that, because women experience those same things and more from these same systems, and then they got to deal with our violence against them as well, right? So there's multiple levels and layers of it. But what ends up happening in these cases is that when we think about race, we think about black men or men of color. When we think about gender, we think about women only, right? Or white women primarily. So what ends up happening is that because we're dealing with the fact that, it could be Diddy, it could be R. Kelly, whatever situation, example it may be, is that they will experience some level of racism and different treatment than a white person who did the same act. That's real, right? But we cannot get lost in that because we minimize the experience of that woman and the experiences of harm, because we value, there's really value in maleness over womanness or womanhood, to the point where we get caught up in what will happen to Diddy because of that system, rather than what did Diddy do? What harm did he do? And what reparations can take shape and form based on the harm that he did, because we get caught up in the race. So I always kind of tell my staff and people I work with, you got to address that, because we work a lot with men. Most of our work is with women, actually. But there's like a timing thing. Deal with the race thing, but put primary the woman's experience, particularly women of color's experience around that issue first, and don't negate it or minimize it, because it always ends up getting lost in that.
Okay, somebody speak to strategies to get these interventions in the natural in vivo environment. Somebody.
Okay, like for example, modeling, and we can make that kind of a commercial type of a thing, right?
Okay.
Everybody hear this thing now called Girl Dad, right? Obama had the 2 girls. It became a slogan. Everyone heard about it, right? So if we can model what this is like, if we can talk about it and then make it known, put it out there on social media. Let these young men and these other men our age, our peers, see how we interact, how we engage, what is supposed to be the normal, what would be an ideal interaction and engagement, how to handle that situation. I think in those situations, those would be some ways for us to combat that immediately, and put those situations right in the home, right there in the immediate circumstance where it's needed.
Right. Yeah. Okay, somebody speak to what can be done starting tomorrow, all of us can do as a takeaway, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Real quick, talk about today, what this was, how great it was, how great the speakers are, but of course, like,
well, give us some steps, some concrete
I am.
So tomorrow, I want to impact this problem.
That's the first step. Talk about today.
Right.
Right.
So then what about
why was Downstate doing this event? Why is it important now we talk about, and really black men in leadership around domestic violence, right? It's an issue that it doesn't discriminate. The resources available are the things that are the difference between the group of people who are impacted by this. The other step is what I mentioned before: consistently talk about it, communicate about this all the time, not us, but the issue, and that is a real concern. The third C we talked about already: creativity. Show a movie, show a documentary, show a pop culture film, break down how women show up in that, how men show up in that. What is the power and control in that? What type of abuse was that really? The things that we normalize to be healthy, break that down. And I think just, and having, number one, probably having the courage to talk about it. And, and sisters and women talk about it all the time, but to men to talk about this other brother, Byron Hurt, he's a filmmaker. You got to follow his work. He does a lot of work around. He's what we do, but a filmmaker.
Name again?
Byron Hurt. Beyond Beats and Rhymes. He wrote the film on Soul Food Junkies. He has one out on hazing now. But it's, and we talk about being in bachelor parties, like without consciousness around gender and dynamics. We always say, like, yo, Q, what do you say when the brothers are partaking in some really, sexual activity there that could be, not healthy. So, we have to kind of think about, is this the best moment in time to deal with this, or is there another time? And usually there's another time. We make sure that there's no harm being done in a way, or, and then have these conversations with the brothers later on, but really kind of picking out the time and the creativity in the moment to have these conversations.
Okay, thank you.
I can give a quick. Let me
Go
get
ahead.
my edge. in.
Go ahead, get your edge in.
Give a
Because we
quick
still haven't fully
bibliography.
addressed it, but I'm gonna tell you
I
why
want
in a
some
minute.
light time.
Get your edge in. I'm gonna tell you why
Yeah,
we haven't done it justice.
I got to bring my academic side in here too. I think there's like some books that could be really powerful and enlightening. I'm thinking about Bell Hooks, A Call of Men. I'm thinking about like the work of Audre Lorde. There's a book by Ken Hardy called Racial Trauma. I was thinking about what Q was saying around how that stuff gets conflated a lot, like our experiences of systems and the harm that we do to others and how we can use that as excuses. I was thinking about Ken Hardy. He talks a lot about like validating our rage, and you could get you could be validated and also do other things that are healthy and not take them out on other people. So those are places to start too if people want to make a change and a contribution. Just inform yourself and think about ways to digest some of that material.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We're going to get some audience participation. Okay, but before we do that, let me make one other comment. So human beings and change. We know that education and awareness is not enough for change. And that's the fact. That's why we're not seeing much change, because everybody's talking about education and awareness. It's the first step, but it doesn't mean change. What's next? Understanding. That means taking that education and awareness and applying it to you and your situation. Then what's next? Behavior has to change. How does behavior change? You got to practice. You need some new skills. The programs right now are not giving people that. And then what has to happen? You got to go into that environment where that person functions on a daily basis and change the values and mores in that environment. Until that happens, you can have all the knowledge, awareness, understanding, personalize that knowledge and awareness, and the skill. When you go back to that environment that has not been impacted, it's immediately undone. This is why human beings and change is such a big deal. And it's tough. You wonder why. We've been talking about domestic violence for years. We haven't seen much change because the interventions are not comprehensive enough to incorporate all those components. Until we do that, we're not going to see it. Okay. Well, before comments, experts? Okay. All right, questions. I want the mic out as well.
Hi. Question. What preventive measures are there to curtail certain aggressive behaviors? For example, 3-year-old boy. The stereotype of an angry boy or an angry black man. When I saw this 3-year-old, who's actually my great nephew, I met him at 3, and his face was just full of anger. And it questions, why is a child so full of anger? Where does it derive from? So when I approached him and I asked him, why are you so angry? He was very standoffish and while my sister, whatever, he had mentioned, rambled a bit. So I said, you know what? I love you. And I held him. And he began to open up. Now, fast forward, he's now 7, age 5. His grandfather brought him home from school. We're in the garage. He walks to his grandmother, punched her in the gut. I have zero tolerance for such behaviors, and she did nothing. Oh, no, it's first, but it's some lifestyle. She did nothing. So I approached him, chastised him, held him accountable in the moment, and timeout until he figured out what was the process was going through his mind without provocation to be so aggressive towards a maternal figure who lavishes everything on him. So, how does one prevent or curtail such behaviors or help guide this young man? School, kindergarten, is it like first grade? He has a tendency to hit females. What made it worse, because the school he went to was a Catholic school, and the majority of students, he was a minority. And he was actually expelled for that aggressive behavior. So I see the patterns, but how do we change that so it doesn't escalate as he becomes an adult? It's open to anyone.
Clinicians want to take that?
The family therapist in me, in my mind. Right. So I actually am a family therapist, and I think there's so many different factors that could contribute to young male aggression, young child aggression in general. And I think there's a lot of things that I would want to ask the family. One of the things that's really big is male socialization, both not only what they're witnessing and what they're experiencing at home, but also how we're responding to them. And I think your thought of both like boundary and love and affection sounds like something that's really important. So the clinician in me is also going to be responsible enough to not try to give you any kind of intervention right now, because I don't quite know enough. But one thing I do know is in working with families, I can see how, especially in this particular context where there's such violent patriarchy happening, I wonder about how do we miss some stuff with our kids? Do we get afraid of them? Do we think about how we engage with them in a way to get this stuff out of here? And do we miss the need? And do we model for young men and men in particular, you need to work this out. Like, you got to figure this out. So I think your idea of both not self-soothing, helping him soothe, and also having that boundary is the right one. I think a lot of our solutions are not dichotomous, right? There's a lot of things that are involved that we have to be able to take the time and resource to figure out. And we also need the resources to be able to do this work. So anyway, I wish I had a clearer answer for you, but that is my clinical family therapist answer for you. There's a couple pieces that we have to think about. I know the other clinician will jump in as well.
No, I'm good. Other questions? I want to get more. Who wants a mic?
I don't need a mic. Because we are in an institution, and a lot of the work we probably do, current institutions, I do have one. How can workplaces create environments where men feel empowered to speak up when they see incidents that are concerning, that have an impact on behavior and can potentially become violent in the workplace?
Yeah, I could touch on that really quickly. A lot of the work we did for a long time was in work around making that kind of connections, domestic violence in the workplace, but then also just workplace violence. That's about power and control as well, just a different setting. One, workplaces are a little bit difficult depending on what's the policy there. Do you have like a personal handbook that addresses that? That has to be looked at, or it has to be dusted off, because a lot of times it's there, nobody even knows it. So you have to kind of go through those mechanics. But then also, we created something called Men and Women as Allies, and we did this with Cornell University and the Workers Institute, labor school and Workers Institute. So it took a lot of time around that, but also, maybe having some affinity groups, having spaces where men can talk. But then also really looking what that policy is, because if they are being harmful to each other or harmful towards women, there is something in place. If the place has a union, also look at that. The program that we created brought the corporation and the union together to deal with this thing around domestic violence in the workplace and all that. And we helped shape their policies and all of that where it did not exist. But again, creating spaces where men can talk, women are heard, particularly when they are harmed and they disclose this there has to be a policy in place. I worked with the union. I'll keep quiet about the union, but the person doing harm was a great, great, great community organizer. Very powerful speaker, can reach people, et cetera, et cetera. But he was doing harm towards women. And the labor union was like, this dude is too important to take us seriously, kind of thing. And it just really eventually disrupted the whole union because they did nothing about harm that a male did. So I came in, did some restorative justice with them and some other types of groups. And it impacted the culture eventually, right? Because you want to transform that culture where it says that is not okay. And it depends also on the type of field and work that agency is doing as downstate. I mean, I think you have more room to make that a policy to deal with that.
If I could just add one thing in there, I champion everything he said too. One of the things I know about some of these things like ERGs and groups too as well is that they're oftentimes dependent on like the staff and how skilled the staff is. So I know at Connect, circles are probably going to be incredible because you guys do that a lot. I know at my agency, I invested a lot of times into like circle practice and different practices. These things can't be like something that checks a box. Like they have to be things that are really invested into and done with skill. So people can't feel comfortable and they have the frameworks and the resources to go there. You can get ahead of stuff too. I just wanted to add that because oftentimes we make assumptions about how effective it's going to be in places. Right.
Okay, another question right here.
Yes.
Gentlemen.
Peace and blessings, everyone. First and foremost, I want to commend you men for stepping up and speaking on a very, very important conversation. I commend everybody for being here. My name is Sam Goody-Jacques. I'm a co-founder of an organization called I Can Do Better. I also work for Living Redemption, Love Harlem. Love means love over violence every time. And I also think it means love over violence for everyone. So to piggyback over some of the questions, because this is an ongoing thing and it stems from in your home, in school, and in the workplace from childhood, I think it's something that we need to speak about more, which is very taboo in the household, in schools, and in the world. It's a very, very, very like touchy eggshell kind of a subject that nobody wants to speak on. And I think we need more transparency with each other and ourselves to speak on it. And my question is, should this be in the DOE curriculum starting at elementary school, middle school, high school, and continuously in the workplace, and even in our congregations, because this is something that's swept under the rug. Anybody could cause any kind of violence, no matter what title you are, what religious beliefs you have, and this is something that we sweep under the rug too many times. And I'm speaking as a man that's witnessed this since childhood, and nobody ever spoke about it, frowned about it. We live in a mind your business culture, especially people of color, that we're just afraid to say the wrong thing or get the wrong person in trouble for making these decisions, these terrible decisions. So once again, my question is, should we have this taught throughout life, from elementary through adulthood? It never stops.
That's a unanimous yes.
Yes, okay, unanimous. All right. Other questions?
We definitely need to connect.
That was an easy one, bro.
Awesome unit.
I'm really just here working, but I do have a personal experience. I was walking down Clarkson. I walk down Clarkson every day, and you know, as a man, when you walk close to a woman, like especially a black man, like you know, it's like I start to feel like I need to back up. I need to give him space. Like I don't want to stress anybody out. So I was walking, and this kid who was with his mother turned around and held his hand up and said, "Stop." Right? So it affected me. I smiled and I laughed, and the mom was laughing and said, "He don't care about you." And, you know, it affected me and made me think of my childhood and what I want to do for my mom. And, you know, it's weird in 2024 to try and be a mentor to kids. Like, so like, I'm wondering, how do you do that effectively? Because, you know, nowadays it's like, it's so much more out in the open that people are abusing children and whatnot, but like, how do you be a mentor without being, you know, weird?
By modeling, like you just said, by being an example and modeling the behaviors that you want that child to follow. Being a good example and being consistent. We spoke about that all the time. Consistently, being a role model or an example, following your own advice. What you would tell that young man, You keep that in the back of your mind and your purview, and you let that be your motivation. And that's it. It's just that simple. Kids are the children that I work with, and someone said it earlier, especially young, my kids, minority children, they're looking for a connection. It doesn't matter with whom. And sometimes, most of the time, that connection is a bad influencer out there in the street because we don't take time, especially for young black boys. If they're not in trouble, we don't have much conversation. Go keep yourself busy, right? We need to engage our black boys. We need to engage our children. Keep them engaged and modeling these behaviors, having those difficult conversations. And again, talking about the stereotypes about masculinity. What is that? What does that mean? And exactly giving it a real definition, right? How, what a partner is, not just a wife or a co-sponsor. You want a partner. You're looking for a partnership, like the language that we use, everything. This is what we talking about, making a difference. It starts by the language, the way you perceive things, and what you're going to do about it as of today. When you see it, how are you going to address it? Are you going to speak to it? You're going to turn the other head. What are you going to do about it?
Dr. Lewis, real quick, and I agree 100%. But the one thing we have to add on to that is that we got to make sure we know who's in front of our kids having those conversations.
Right.
So I think that's where training comes in these conversations with mentors and coaches, et cetera, because they can, even though they're consistent, I call it the whisper in the ear. Whoever's whispering the most consistently in the air, that young person will be gravitated towards. So we got to give them different voices, but also make sure that the one who's teaching or modeling is modeling some healthy stuff.
I think we have time for one more question back in the back. I know we have a couple more. So one more question for the big group, and then other questions come up to see the panel once we adjourn.
I work at the Office for Institutional Equity, and prior to that, I worked at Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solution. And I think the problem that we're talking about today, it intersects with so many other public health concerns, specifically firearm violence and injury. And so I wanted to know if you can talk a little bit more about IRPA or red flag laws, if you are familiar with that, and how is it that you deal with the intersection of firearm violence with intimate partner violence as well?
Sorry to dominate this on this, but the latter question I can answer to, right? Yeah, domestic violence and gun violence is a intersection, right? A dangerous one, and not in the ways that people typically think. Yes, folks who have guns and that are violent in their relationships, the lethality is much higher. But I like to concentrate on the young kid who witnesses gun violence in a home, which is part of domestic violence. Because a lot of times, you threaten them with a gun, et cetera, et cetera. More children who witness gun violence or domestic violence in the home are more apt to be involved with gun violence and gang violence. So we have to kind of look at that. There's so many correlations around that. So I'm glad you mentioned that piece. The red flag laws, I'm not current on that, so I can't speak to that.
All right, thank you all for coming today. We wish we had a lot more time, but we really don't. So if you have additional questions, I would encourage you to come up to talk to our panel afterwards. I think we'll be around for a few more minutes.
Yes, and I don't need the mic. I really do want to say thank you all for coming, and I just want to give a plug for what's happening next week. Please keep an eye on your email. We're hosting, as we do each year, a photo shoot for domestic violence awareness. There are t-shirts, but you can't get one unless you come to be part of the photo shoot. But it is critical because this is more than just about the t-shirts. It's really about standing with others to provide the support and the advocacy that we do need to make sure that these conversations keep happening. Oh, I got more to say. Okay. Okay, I don't think I have more to say, but I do want to encourage you all. And we hear if you see something, say something. It is very critical. And to the panelists, I really thank you so much for being here. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for the work that you continue to do. And we can't do this without you. So I want to let you know how much it means to me personally, but to everyone else, how critical this work is and how important it is that you were a part of the conversation today. So thank you.
Thank you.